Over the next 10 minutes, I would very briefly introduce you to what we have been doing in Penta for viral hepatitis and focusing on hepatitis B, and then I will try to provide my pediatric perspective on the challenges with treatment of hepatitis B. I don't tend to introduce Penta, but I started working with Penta on viral hepatitis in 2008, and I have seen the evolution of Penta, the inclusion of viral hepatitis, the inclusion of all the other different infectious diseases, and of course doing it at the highest possible level of science. It is crucial, I think, to know that recently different research areas and working groups have been created within Penta in order to optimize the approach, the scientific approach to the current challenges for each of these specific research areas. HIV is included in viral hepatitis, and this is really important. We know that these viruses are actually sharing a lot in terms of virology, in terms of management, in terms of approach to children with chronic infections. The purpose of the HIV and viral hepatitis working group is to optimize prevention and treatment, of course, of HIV and viral hepatitis. And I think that it is nice to see that we are actually focusing at pregnant women, children, and young people living with this infection. When we go directly to the, let's say, hepatitis subgroup of this working group, as you can see, the overall aim is quite ambitious, is to contribute to the elimination of viral hepatitis as a public health threat by 2013, with 3 different specific areas. As you know, very recently, I will show you one slide in a few minutes, the WHO hepatitis B guidelines have been updated. There are different informations. What the most relevant one is that adolescents have been included in the treatment indication of adults. There is a lot of discussion around this inclusion, and of course it will be nice as well to discuss with you at the end of this Penta aperitivo. Of course, we want to generate real-world data. We have to rely on real-world data. We have to stand on real-world data for on hepatitis B outcomes. Still, there is a lot to understand in the natural history of hepatitis B in childhood. And these informations are crucial in order to try to understand how we can improve, optimize, choose, focus on the different treatment options that today we are very lucky because we will hear from Gail and adult hepatologists her perspective on the pipeline of treatments for hepatitis B. We started our activities as Penta on hepatitis C. You know that the story of hepatitis B recently has been a very successful story, and we've more or less followed the same path that we are trying to follow for hepatitis B. We tried to create collaboration using the Penta network and standing on the Eastern European partners, carrying out epidemiological studies on hepatitis C monoinfection, and we were focusing as well on co-infections. Creating a network was one of the major aims. We were able to work pediatric infectious disease specialists together with pediatric hepatologists. I tried to do a connection between the 2 different worlds that are actually sharing many activities, and for hepatitis C, I think that we were able to work together. One of the major activities in the Penta, in our Penta activities, was to create a multi-center study of more than 300 children and adolescents with chronic hepatitis C, working closely with Russia. There are some publications that we are very proud of over the last few years. We were able to apply for a European grant that was successful, and this is the REACH study, the Russian-European Alliance for Research among Women, Children and Adolescents impacted by HIV, TB and HIV. I think that it has been a wonderful experience led by Anna. And again, some publication came out from this activity. Penta was involved as well in some partnership with policymakers. The most important one, I think, was the one with the World Health Organization. Many Penta network members are well represented on the WHO-led pediatric hepatitis working group and were included in the international guidelines development group. And we were working on the 2018 and 2023 hepatitis C guidelines, as well as on the 2024 update of the hepatitis B guidelines. I'm a member of as a pediatric hepatologist of the European Society for Pediatric Gastroenterology, Hepatology, and Nutrition. I think that being homogeneous and providing homogeneous information in position paper and guidelines from different societies is extremely important. This is the reason why we are actually working at the update of the existing guidelines for treatment of hepatitis B infection in children. And Penta people, of course, and Penta professionals are included in this guideline development. One of the important activities of Penta is Penta training, and recently in 2022 we started our first experience on a dedicated Penta training on viral hepatitis in children. As you can see, this has been repeated in 2024, and we had a good number of delegates coming from more than 50 countries from all around the world. And now going straight to hepatitis B, the reason why Penta is interested in hepatitis B, the reason why we as clinicians and scientists are interested in hepatitis B is because you know that there are epidemiological aspects that are important, with millions of people worldwide carriers of hepatitis B S antigen. Children are included in the burden of chronic hepatitis B, and despite all of our efforts, still there is a lot of work to do to reduce the millions of deaths that hepatitis B is causing every year and over the last and the future decades. We know that the problem is, of course, a problem for low and middle income countries. It's less relevant for high income countries, but we have learned from HIV and from hepatitis C that whatever we do in high income countries is important and crucial for having a big impact in those countries where the burden of the infection is at the highest, and so in low and middle income countries. And Penta is in the great position of having connection and having a network that goes clearly beyond the high income countries. You are perfectly aware that one of the problems for pediatric chronic infections is that most of the times, we are actually waiting for the results of the adult study. This is what has happened for hepatitis C. And this is a cartoon on the new EASL nomenclature for chronic phases. And as you can see, the old terminology of the different phases of hepatitis B have been replaced by a more systematic approach where the infection is defined by the presence or absence of the E antigen of HBV DNA and on the presence of normal or elevated transaminases. The major problem that we have for hepatitis B is that children usually have a natural history that is different from adults. So one of the problems that probably we will face in the future is that whatever will happen on the adult side should be confirmed and should be actually evaluated in a specific way in children. This is a paper that we published a few years ago, but I want to share with you only one information. The majority of our children are chronically infected, vertically acquired infection with E antigen positivity. And at the end of our observation as pediatricians, some of these children, but I would say a good proportion of these children, is actually presenting a spontaneous seroconversion from the E antigen positive phase to the E antigen negative phase of the infection. And this is relevant because, as I told you before, in 2023, there was the development of the new update of the WHO guidelines. And the most important part of these guidelines is that the indication for treatment of adults has been the indication for treatment for adults, adolescents have been included, and adolescents were defined as those older than 12 years of age. And as you can see, the presence of viremia together with elevated ALT is one of the clear indications for treatment. And maybe we can discuss whether we all agree on this indication by the WHO. The drugs that we have so far available, further to pegylated interferon, we have the nucleoside and nucleotide analogs, TAF, TDF, and entecavir, approved more or less starting from very early age for hepatitis B. But the major problem that we have nowadays is that if you look at the different definitions of cure, and I'm sure that we will learn more later on these definitions, the actual performance and the effectiveness of these nucleoside analogs, entecavir, tenofovir, and of pegylated interferon is quite deluded in terms of the number and the percentage of children who are treated and actually can achieve the functional cure. This is the biggest challenge that we have for hepatitis B nowadays. We have drugs, we have indications for treatment that have been updated by WHO. The International Scientific Society still are reluctant in aligning with these WHO indications, and the performance of the drugs that we have in order to obtain the functional cure that is the achievable target, the achievable target for this treatment is quite low, and the uptake of treatment by at least pediatric hepatologists and infectious disease specialists overall has been quite low over time. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to learning more on the treatment of hepatitis C or hepatitis B over the next 30 minutes. Thank you.
It's lovely to be here. As you can hear from my bio, I'm usually based in Sydney, but I am in the UK for a period of time, and it's been wonderful to be here. I have to also acknowledge that I am not a paediatrician, and I don't do any paediatric work, so I am talking very much from an adult perspective, but with really lots to interact, I think, with the paediatric perspective, and I really look forward to some discussion. As per many people here, hepatitis B really is one of my passions. I think it's been a virus that has been very under talked about with all the HIV and hepatitis C work that has gone on over the past decades. But I think hepatitis B's time is coming, and it's a time of great excitement in the hepatitis B world. But I think this is why I titled my cure hepatitis B cure reality or fantasy, because I think we need to think very carefully about what we mean when we talk about hepatitis B cure and consider some of the challenges with it. So I think Giuseppe's done an amazing job to give a sort of bit of background and to sort of set the stage. As you all know, hepatitis B remains a really huge global challenge, 226 million people affected and a million or so dying each year. And the region where I come from, the Asia Pacific and the Western Pacific region, has really one of the highest burdens, and that's why it's so relevant, particularly for us where we are. Most of the deaths due to liver cancer or the complications of cirrhosis. And again, the WHO, you'll not be aware, has set global hepatitis elimination goals by 2030. But as you can see, in fact, most of those goals are here. We have the 90% diagnosed, the 80% treated of those who are eligible, the 65% drop in mortality. None of those goals are anywhere near being achieved by 2030. In fact, the only goal that could be achieved by 2030 by current modelling is the reduction in surface antigen prevalence to less than 0.1% in the under 5-year-olds. And in fact, the cure, if you think of cure as a global issue, the cure of hepatitis B is really going to be driven by vaccination, and that is ultimately the case because the majority of new infections are driven, as you'll be aware, by mother-to-child transmission, particularly in the very early stages, and also then through childhood, but becoming less so as people become exposed in adulthood. So vaccination, including birth dose, an appropriate vaccination strategy, etc. We're going to talk about that a bit later, is really going to be the key to solving hepatitis B long term. But here you can see, as Giuseppe also mentioned, the regions achieving that seroprevalence target in the under fives. We are doing it in high-income countries, but Africa is way off track, as is many areas in the Asia-Pacific region. And even if we were to vaccinate every child appropriately born in the world today, it would still take many years for the hepatitis B burden to work through. So we really have to think about strategies to improve people's outcome from hepatitis B, including children, in the meantime. So I think we need to think about what we actually mean by hepatitis B cure. And if you think about it, there are many goals of cure, some of which are related to clinical goals. So you want to prevent liver disease progression, progression to failure and transplant. Preventing HCC development is a really important goal of cure in people living with hepatitis B, irrespective of their liver disease. We want to stop transmission, both vertically and horizontally. For patients, we want to improve their quality of life, particularly if they have extrahepatic manifestations, but many people with hepatitis B simply don't like living with hepatitis B. We want to limit the pill burden, or if possible, get rid of it completely, and lessen the stigma and discrimination that comes as being identified as being S antigen positive. So there are many different goals of cure that we want to achieve, both for individuals and for society as a whole. I think it's really important, though, when we talk about hepatitis B cure, to think about the viral life cycle, because this is really a sort of very critical thing to understand when we look at cure. So I'm just going to spend a couple of moments just walking through it. It's much more complicated than hepatitis C, a little bit more aligned to HIV, but still some very unique features of hepatitis B. So, the hepatitis B virus enters the liver cell, the hepatocyte, in the cytoplasm, and then it gets taken into the nucleus of the cell. And a few very important things happen here. Firstly, it forms this cccDNA, which is a very stable form of DNA called covalently closed circular DNA. And this, as I say, is very stable in the nucleus, and it's where all the new RNA constructs are sort of arising from. The RNA constructs come about through transcription, and then they are taken out into the cytoplasm. And this is very important here to realize, because some of these RNA constructs, the pgRNA does go down the reverse transcriptase route to make new viruses, which are then released out into the circulation. But other pieces of the RNA go through a different process whereby, and this is the route by which large amounts of the surface antigen and the e antigen protein are made, and it's secreted out of the cell separately from viral release into the system, and it is these which cause the immune tolerance largely. So drugs that work on the reverse transcriptase process are not dealing at all with this S antigen and E antigen production, and that's part of the problem. The other thing to note is this cycle where the reverse transcription happens. Some of this actually gets repurposed back into the nucleus of the cell and actually integrated into the host genome. And this is also a big challenge, and it's why there is the particular oncogenic risk with hepatitis B. So also we have to understand the different definitions of cure, and Giuseppe touched on this briefly, but just to highlight this again. So partial cure really isn't cure. It's when people are sustained, they're off drug, they don't have active DNA, so the DNA level is low and normal ALT, but they remain S antigen positive. And really in this state, there's a high risk of reactivation, and we wouldn't really consider this a cure. The next step, if you like, on the cure pathway is what we call functional cure. And what this means is where patients lose a surface antigen, so they become S antigen negative. That's very important because that's the definition of how we define people actually with hepatitis B. So functional cure is losing S antigen for at least 6 months. You may or may not gain anti-HBs. That's not so important, but you've lost surface antigen. Now, in this situation, the cccDNA is transcriptionally inactive, and there is a low risk of reactivation, but it's not gone. So it can still reactivate, as you know, under conditions, for example, of immunosuppression. The complete cure is when you actually lose the CCC DNA from the liver cell, and that obviously is a better definition of cure than functional cure, but very difficult to achieve. And the most extreme definition of cure, sterilizing cure, is when you actually remove the integrated hepatitis B DNA from the nucleus of the cell. So that's a sterilizing cure. And realistically, the only way that will be achieved is with gene technology, which actually is being developed. But for all intents and purposes, when we're talking about cure in today's climate, what we're talking about is functional cure. That is loss of surface antigen for more than 6 months off therapy. So why does the loss of surface antigen itself, why is that so important when we have drugs which can virologically suppress people for years and years and are very easy to take? Well, we know that if you clear your surface antigen, you decrease your risk of HCC. So in the top graph, this is a very large cohort of people treated with nucleoside analogues. They're all virologically suppressed, but you can see if they've lost surface antigen, that's in the blue line, the HCC risk is very low, whereas there's still an incremental risk of HCC in the setting of virological suppression with positive surface antigen. And it seems to matter when you clear your surface antigen. So the bottom graph really just shows that if you clear your surface antigen before the age of 50, then again, your risk of HCC is much reduced. So this has some implications when we talk about when we start people on these treatments. And of course, the rates of surface antigen loss with our current therapies are very low. So they all have very high rates of virological suppression. But in fact, the surface antigen loss rate is only between 2 and 5% after 10 years. So we're nowhere near achieving the rates of S antigen loss we need to reduce long-term complications. And for all the other reasons, I say people don't want to be on therapy long-term if they can help it. We also need to think about how we measure cure, because our current biomarkers are limited to hepatitis B DNA, ALT, and qualitative surface antigen and e antigen. And these have been fine, but they're fairly blunt measures of success, particularly as we move to a more nuanced understanding of what hepatitis B cure means. And so we'll be moving into the future to different biomarkers, quantitative surface antigen, something that's really important. I think you're going to hear more and more about this if you don't already, because it's now a very commonly used clinical trial endpoint and also in actual practice. And I'd be interested to know whether it's being measured routinely in your clinics of viral hepatitis. The reason why it's so important is because the level of baseline quantitative surface antigen and also the rapidity of decline during treatment is a very strong predictor of whether you're going to lose surface antigen or not. And that's why it's going to become increasingly important with the new therapies. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. There are also other biomarkers, new biomarkers, so hepatitis B RNA, which is transcribed directly from that triple C DNA, so it's a much better marker of what's going on within the nucleus of the cell, and correlated antigen, another surrogate marker of transcriptional activity. So these are different markers, they're measuring different things. At the moment, I think we're a little bit unclear about how we should use them in validation and so on, but into the future, again, they'll tell us much more about what's actually happening within the hepatocyte to the hepatitis B. So we need better therapies. We also need better ways of understanding and measuring what we mean by cure as we go into a new era of treatments. And there are a lot of barriers to curing hepatitis B, not least of which, once you sort of understand the life cycle, you can realize, because there, as I said, there is this reservoir of this very stable triple C DNA within the nucleus. There is integrated hepatitis B DNA in the host genome. There is this really complex life cycle that's going on at different levels within the cell. We also have outside of the cell a dysfunctional T cell response because of those large amounts of surface antigen and e antigen being produced. We have insufficient B cell responses and inefficient innate response. So really both the immune and the virus combine to make this an incredibly challenging, complex environment. But that also offers opportunity to intervene at many different points of the virus life cycle. So, we can attack the virus at entry, a bit like we're doing with HIV. So entry inhibitors, we can target the triple C DNA. We can target RNA production. We can inhibit the polymerase, and that's where our current drugs are working, the tegavir, tenofovir, etc. We can also target S antigen production, which is going down that different pathway. We can target capsid assembly, the putting together of the virus, and we can also look at multiple approaches to restore hepatitis B specific immune responses. And it's probably going to be a combination of many of these different areas where we can interact with the virus and the immune system that is going to really achieve the cure that we're sort of after. And if you look, for example, at this website down the bottom, you will see there are many, many novel therapies in development for hepatitis B. And they fall into three major classes. These are drugs that inhibit viral replication at various points in the viral life cycle. There are drugs that lower the viral antigen burden. So that's the S antigen and the E antigen, but mainly the S antigen production. And then there are drugs that boost the immune response. And you can see these are just classes. These aren't even individual drugs within classes. So there's a huge amount of development in the pipeline. But I'm not going to go into lots of it because of time, but I just want to show you a couple of snapshots of what's happening so you can get a sense of where things are. And the first drug I'm going to talk about is an antisense oligonucleotide, which is acting in this class of drugs in the middle there. And that is a drug called bepirovirsen, or Bepi. It's one of the first novel therapies we will probably have access to. Where it works, if you look at that life cycle picture up in the top right, it's working in that area in the red circle there, which is it's working to interrupt RNA production and therefore lower S antigen production, as well as through other aspects of the life cycle. It's given as a subcutaneous injection once a week for 12 to 24 weeks. In fact, 24 weeks is what it's going to be going forward with. This is the study design for the phase 2b randomized trial, which was in the New England Journal a couple of years ago, called Be Clear. I'm not going to go into great detail about this, but just to note that these were people who are both on and off stable nucleotide analog therapy. And this was a dose finding and a sort of strategy to look at what was the best dose and duration for this new drug, Bepi. The primary endpoint of this trial, and in fact all new trials of hepatitis B therapy, is functional cure. The way that's being defined usually is a surface antigen way below the very lowest limit of detection, plus a hepatitis B DNA, which is undetectable, that is sustained for 24 weeks at least from the end of treatment without having to restart therapy. So that's the primary endpoint of most of these studies. So if you look at this study, which is the first new drug we've had for a while, and just focus these two graphs. The left-hand side is the people who are on nucleotides. The right are people who are not on nucleotides. They're actually pretty similar. So if you just focus on the left-hand side, this is people who are on nucleotide analog therapy, and you've got two different charts there. There's what happens at the end of the treatment, the 24 weeks, and what happens 24 weeks after. And that first group in the orange, is the dose that's being taken forward. And what you can see there is that the surface antigen, the rate of functional cure, if you like, S antigen loss 24 weeks after ceasing treatment with this new drug was about 9%. 9 to 10%, that's where it was sitting. So this is not phenomenal response rates, right? This is incremental improvements in S antigen loss. It was generally well tolerated, though, so there weren't too many problems with the drug, even though it was given subcutaneously for 24 weeks. The other important thing is that what this study told us, which is becoming increasingly clear through all the studies, is that your response really depended on the amount of quantitative surface antigen, so the amount of surface antigen you had before you started treatment. So if you just look at the very furthest to the left there, the graph with the 3 bars, the purple bar is the 9%. That's overall surface antigen loss in the dose that's being taken forward. But if you go to the light yellow, that's in people who have surface antigen less than 3,000. And if you take people who have surface antigen less than 1,000 before they start therapy, their rate of S antigen loss almost doubles to 16%. So you can see that the people do well with these treatments are the people who have very low surface antigen levels to start off with, which of course makes sense. And there are a couple of ongoing studies to look at extended follow-up, because one of the problems with these drugs is that you may get seroreversion the further down the track you follow these patients, as opposed to those who lose surface antigen during natural history. And this is the first drug. It received a US FDA fast track designation. I think it's going to many regulatory authorities early next year with various caveats around its use, and we could talk about that. The other thing I want to say about drug development, the other data I want to show you, which is very recent data from SSLD just a month or so ago, is what happens when you actually start to put multiple drugs together. So this, I'm going to show you a study called March, which took two drugs from the that inhibit viral replication, the nucleoside, which we usually use, plus an entry inhibitor, and then another drug, an siRNA, which lowered viral antigen burden, and also an immune response booster, in this case, pegylated interferon. So this is the March study, and it looked at two new drugs, tobevibart, which is a monoclonal antibody, elbasiran, which is an siRNA, so working at different aspects of the viral life cycle. It combined them with people who were already on nucleotides, so that was the third drug, and then also with pegylated interferon in a subgroup. So some people had 3 drugs, some people had 4 drugs in this study. And again, they were followed through to the primary endpoint, which was essentially functional cure. The message I want to give you from this is that here we have at the top the S antigen loss overall, both end of treatment in the first bar and then at 24 weeks post-treatment. So you can see there's a reversion that occurs after the end of treatment in patients, so they flip back. And gain the surface antigen again. So you need to follow these patients long term. And what we can see, the highest rates of functional cure S antigen loss in this group were those people who were on 4 drugs. So they had to have the pegylated interferon as well as the other 3 drugs to get to that 16% surface antigen loss and functional cure. And again, similar to the previous study I showed you, the functional cure was highest in those with low baseline quantitative S. So it reached 21% in that group with low S and who had all 4 drugs. But still, 21% is not everybody. In fact, it's far from everybody. So what does this tell us? What does this data tell us about the current challenges, I guess, in the cure pipeline? Well, firstly, that rates of functional cure are improving, but they're still very suboptimal. We know that seroreversion can occur and it's likely to possibly increase over time. So durability may be an issue, and long-term follow-up studies is going to be really important. It's something industry doesn't do very well. At the moment, pegylated interferon or an immune modulator is probably going to be very likely to be an integral component of many regimens, as well as antiviral drugs. We don't know how these drugs are going to have to be given. Subcut is often how they're being given at the moment. Hopefully there'll be oral regimens coming through the pipeline, but we're not there yet. We don't know how best to use these drugs. Do you give one after the other? Do you use them all up front? Do you do sequential use of different combinations? We have no idea how best to put all these different classes together. It's certainly not going to be a one-size-fits-all like hepatitis C DAAs are, at least in the start. So patient selection is going to be challenging. They're only going to be suitable for certain groups of patients. There's going to be added complexity of monitoring, bringing treatment back into specialist services when we've been trying to decentralize it in many areas. And of course, the drugs are going to be very expensive. So these are all real challenges, I think, in terms of where we are now for hepatitis B cure. And I think it's also important, and I want to talk the last few minutes of the talk, is to be pragmatic about this, because we have to remember that most hepatitis B infections are in low middle income countries, and this cure pipeline is really happening very much in high income countries at the moment. So there is an urgent need to improve outcomes where hepatitis B actually is predominantly located. So pragmatic steps to cure hepatitis B on a global level. As Giuseppe mentioned, the WHO hepatitis B guidelines released in May 2024 were significantly different from previously. And the reason for that were really very concerning statistics. In 2019, only 10% of people globally with hepatitis B were diagnosed and only 2% were on treatment. This is with the therapies we have at the moment. And in sub-Saharan Africa, that was 2% diagnosed and 0.1% on treatment. We also know that Hep B birth dose is around 45%. It is way off 90% where it should be. And in the African region, it is only 18%. And immunoglobulin, as part of the strategy to prevent mother-to-child transmission, is rarely available. So there was an urgent need to revise the guidelines in a very pragmatic public health approach. And in fact, the guidelines had 29 recommendations, 14 of which were new. We don't have time to go into all of them. Giuseppe mentioned the WHO to treat guidelines, which have been markedly broadened. I just want to touch on the mother-to-child transmission because there were some important changes here. So what we had previously said was in settings where hepatitis B DNA or e antigen testing were available, that was the most recent recommendation, that tenofovir was recommended for pregnant women who either had a hepatitis B DNA over 200,000 or had a positive e antigen. And that's because there's very good data to support that will halt transmission on top of the other strategies. But recognizing that in many settings, neither hepatitis B DNA or e antigen is available, these new guidelines basically advocate for prophylaxis with tenofovir for all surface antigen positive pregnant women. That's a very important change. And the modeling suggests that that would probably avert around 5 million neonatal infections if it was actioned. Whether it will be delivered or not, I think there's a lot of discussion about that. The other important bit of data around mother-to-child transmission I think is really relevant is that remembering that immunoglobulin, which is in the guidelines for preventing neonatal infection, is not widely available in low middle income settings. This was a study that was done in China looking at two different strategies. The standard strategy, which is tenofovir for 12 weeks, so in sort of at the end of the second trimester, plus vaccine and immunoglobulin, versus a strategy where you just gave tenofovir for a much longer period of time, for 24 weeks, so starting at week 16 of pregnancy. And in fact, that was just as effective, and that was without the immunoglobulin. So that strategy was just as effective, if longer tenofovir, no immunoglobulin. So I think that's really important for low middle income countries where tenofovir actually is now much more easily available than immunoglobulin. So those were two really important bits of information. I think the other thing, just to highlight a bit of work we've been doing very quickly, we've just done a study which has just been accepted in JCM actually to show that fingerstick testing, particularly relevant for children, fingerstick testing of hepatitis B DNA by Cepheid as opposed to venipuncture and so on is just as good. And hopefully that will help also enhance clinical management. And it's all about improving diagnostics, improving linkage to care, as well as improving the drugs. So what is required, I think, to make hepatitis B a reality globally? I think we do need the investment in innovative clinical trials and infrastructure. We do need the pursuit of an eventual one-size-fits-all curative strategy as we have for hepatitis C, because that is the only thing that is going to transform really the therapeutic landscape. We need to bring community in early to co-design trials, particularly they're sitting mostly with industry at the moment, but we need to bring community in to say what's important for them, what do they want to see from trials of hepatitis B cure. We need the simplified test and treat guidelines. I think we have those, or we're starting to get those. We need decentralized care back out into the community so that we can address the huge global burden. We need to tackle stigma and discrimination so that people come forward for testing, the very first point in the sort of treatment cure pathway. And we need to invest in hepatitis B primary prevention. Because, as I said at the start, getting every child vaccinated in an appropriate birth strategy is really going to be the ultimate end game. I'm just going to finish with one slide about innovative clinical trials, because this is my idea. This is not anything that's out there at the moment, but this is where I think, as I've shown you, at the moment, there are many different things in the pipeline, many different drugs with different modes of actions at different stages of development. And industry is interested in only pursuing their own particular drug, but we need to know how to use these drugs together for patients to get the best outcomes. So, a multi-stage, multi-arm, so a MAMS type platform trial for hepatitis B, I think would be really where we want to aim to go towards, so that we can actually look at how we use these drugs properly, put drugs in, take them out, take out the ones that aren't working, stay with the ones that are working. And really that's the way I think we move the cure agenda really forwards. So by finishing, is there light at the end of the tunnel? I think there is, but I think we're still really reaching for the stars a little bit at the moment. But I do hope that we'll get there eventually, and that's where I think I will finish. Thank you.
Have got two questions while we're waiting for the rest. And I know like we have got lots of representatives from different geographic settings. I saw many colleagues from Africa. Please put your questions in the chat or raise your hands if you can. And also Philippines, Asia, Europe, it's kind of across the globe. Gail, in terms of and Giuseppe, I think it's the question for both of you. Giuseppe, you showed that all studies in children of a functional cure, interferon achieved like nearly 20-something%, right? And Gail, you showed that in the best treatment that you throw 4 drugs in adults, you achieve like, you know, in very kind of like thoroughly chosen populations with low hepatitis B surface antigen, around 20%. So in terms of the kids, where are we going? Like, do we need to go back to our interferon treatment? Like, because, you know, some adults considering to put it as a booster, not a booster in terms of boostering, but kind of like, you know, fortifying some immune response, etc. What do we do with kids?
I will let Giuseppe take that because, as I said, I'm not a pediatrician, but just a couple of comments maybe firstly for me. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about when I was sort of putting this together just for tonight was that I suspect, for example, that the quantitative S antigen levels on children are generally through the roof. Because of the issues with the immune tolerance. So these new therapies, as I said, you know, when you go to the big liver disease conferences, they're all talking about, oh yeah, you know, in subpopulations of people with low surface antigen. So, you know, it's not just it's just not going to be children. I think you're going to need a completely different strategy for children than where they're going at the moment. But and that probably has to do with immune modulation. But I'll let Giuseppe take his thoughts on that in terms of how you would do that.
Well, I don't have the answer, but I completely agree with you. I think that the strategy should be different. Having a low HBs antigen is almost impossible in children, and a few of them will present with low HBs antigen, probably are going towards the seroconversion in a very short time. So maybe we can be very brave and treat these children to be successful, but they will anyway get their seroconversion. In terms of pegylated interferon, I have to admit that I hate pegylated interferon. I hate interferon for children. I hate it for adolescents. I think that it has been a nightmare when I was quite a young doctor to prescribe pegylated interferon for hepatitis C and seeing all these adolescents experiencing 6 to 12 months of nightmare in their daily life. Now, the point is that when you use pegylated interferon, you should always make a balance between what you can achieve, that is, of course, 25% if you treat the HBe antigen positive adolescent with raised transaminases, because all the trials have been done selecting the patients who had the raised transaminases, so those who were probably closer to the spontaneous seroconversion, and then all the side effects that are correlated with pegylated interferon. My choice right now is not to use pegylated interferon, but could be the wrong one. Looking at the numbers, you should probably go for pegylated interferon rather than selecting nucleoside analogs or entecavir or tenofovir. The most important part, as you know, when you start tenofovir and entecavir, is that you know when you start, but you don't know when you finish. And when you try to make this decision with a young child or an adolescent, this should be taken in account.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of other things I was just going to which I was sort of thinking about, you know, I think this, there's a really important question because I think it's so difficult in children, but there's a really important question about how early you should be starting treatment to reduce HCC risk, right? How soon can you sort of intervene to prevent that integration, which then sort of drives HCC risk. And I've spoken to a lot of people, including, some community people who are also, one community person who works with us is also a virologist, and he's passionate about treating early because of this risk of integration, and that you should be trying to treat early to reduce that. I don't know. I mean, I do think that in terms of new therapies, I mean, we didn't talk about it because it's complex and we're nowhere near there. But honestly, for children, if we got to some CRISPR technology or some gene editing technology, that's where you'd want to go and give them one shot and clear it. I think that's where the real future would be. But we're way off that.
Like reaching to the stars, then, right? With CRISPR. Gareth,
there is a question from Gareth. Yeah.
Would you like to switch on your camera and ask question live?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Gail. What a great talk. And Giuseppe, thank you very, very much for scene setting like that. And Gail, what can we learn from our successful leveraging of funding for the strategic trials for HIV in the current climate of actually vastly more challenging funding issues? Have you any thoughts for Next B and other MAMS type trials where you would look for funding? I mean, this must be something that you're actively doing. So.
Yeah, well, yes, but I think it's very challenging, I have to say. I mean, I think that the positive, I think we're all in a very negative cycle at the moment of funding, right? For anything, it's very hard to sort of think about funding. I think the two positives are that increasingly MAMS type trials or smart trial designs are understood to be much more efficient. And so I think there is encouragement in those type of trial designs for whatever the indication might be. And I think that industry is going to be a really important partner in these as well, because whilst I think industry at the moment is maybe not quite there in terms of wanting to fund something like this, I think that they will start to realize that it will be really important to know how their drugs are used and in what sequence and in what combination and so on. And I think if we can start to get one or two industry partners interested in understanding this. So, for example, if GSK's got Bepi, right? If they want to, then that then becomes the standard of care. Then you think about how you add other drugs onto that. They may be interested in that kind of approach because they would know that their drug alone is not going to take the market, right? Because it's you can see it's only for a subgroup and it's not great. So, but make it your backbone standard of care and add things on. So, I think it's strategic and there's complicated discussions. I don't think there's an easy solution.
Thank you. Just before I hand back to Anna, I can't help thinking that we need to be listening to you as a group of pediatricians to steer away from being seduced into doing one drug trials with a given pharma company. I mean, that was what I took away from when I heard you talking about this in Bangkok a while ago. Do you agree?
Well, yes, but I think, unfortunately, I think, the pharma companies only want to do their one drug trial, or at least two drugs, but both with their, that they hold. But I really hope that, I think the voice of community is also really important these days. And I really would like to see a sort of global community of scientists and researchers and community, for example, hepatitis B, putting pressure on industry to come to the party with these kind of new approaches so that they don't just go off trying to do their own individual trials, but they will do that, no doubt, to start off with.
Thanks very much.
I also had a quick question, if I may, Anna. Sorry.
Sure, Eleni, go ahead.
Yeah, a quick question for both, actually. Thank you so much. Really lovely. What about the change in the guidance, and what do you think, and what do you do in practice in your clinics, Giuseppe and Gail, with the adolescents and the young adults, where there's no liver disease, high virus load, and what is the discussion there, and what is your view?
And Giuseppe probably has much more experience than me, but because I only deal with the young adults, really. I'm sort of 18 and up.
Yeah.
Young adults are not so, different. I would say actually it's really interesting. We actually are doing some qualitative studies at the moment as guidelines change to understand what people's appetite is, even just for sort of going on to entecavir or tenofovir when they wouldn't have previously been indicated to do that, because it's very, I mean, Giuseppe, I don't know what you think, it's very variable. There are some young adults who desperately want to be on these treatments because they don't want to transmit. They are worried about, transmission to their sexual partners. They may have had a family member who's had a liver cancer. I often see people, from the Asia Pacific, which is a big, our population is very much from Vietnam, Thailand, and China, often have a family history of liver cancer. So some are very, very keen to get on treatment as soon as they possibly can. And then you get others who really don't want to be on treatment. And if you put them on treatment, they probably won't take it consistently.
Yeah, sure.
I don't know, Giuseppe, what's your experience?
Well, my experience, and I can add to my experience, the result of a recent study that we have done in Italy, the treatment uptake over the last 20 years across all the pediatric age was less than 3%. So so far we have not been impacted by the run to treat the patients, and probably we will not be satisfied with the WHO guidelines indications for treatment. To be fair, looking at what Gareth was saying, I have two comments. The first one is that if the main reason for treatment is that we want to reduce the possibility of the integration of DNA of the virus, and so the risk of hepatocellular carcinoma, it makes sense to treat as soon as possible. So even in very young children, to limit the viral replication, to limit the time the child is exposed to high levels of HBV DNA. And secondly, if you think at functional cure, and you can achieve with a very long treatment with entecavir or tenofovir, less than 5%, a very heavy treatment with pegylated interferon, up to 25%. But with bepirovirsen, even if you start when the HBs antigen is very high, you can achieve something around 9% after 24 weeks of treatment. Even as a pediatrician, I would be very attracted by bepirovirsen, because still I think it's the best balance that we have in terms of duration of treatment, quality of life during treatment, side effects, and the achievement of a functional cure that is very low, but still higher than an indeterminate duration treatment with nucleoside analogs.
Exactly. So I think, if you ask, I mean, it's really interesting. So what, as an individual, and you could ask yourself this, what would I be prepared to take for what chance of cure, right? Am I going to be prepared to take a subcutaneous drug once a week, little side effects for 24 weeks to get an extra 10% chance of cure? I think a lot of people would say yes. Right, but it will come down to patient. It will very much come down to patient preference. So I agree. So I think there will be a market for Bevi, but I don't think it's anywhere near going to be the answer for most.
Thanks. I'm just still waiting for more questions to be in the chat, but while I'm very lucky just have an opportunity to ask further questions. Gail, in terms of your next B, hopefully it will realize in some sort of grant and application will be successful. How do you think about including kids in the adult trials?
Yeah, so and just to be very clear, next B is just my sort of idea that I've been working on over the past few months. Is nowhere near sort of any sort of full design or anything. I think it's probably, look, I'm very much of the mindset that we don't we're too separate, right, with children and adolescents and adults, and I think generally we should be trying to work together to be broader in terms of our eligibility, particularly for the 12 and up, the adolescents. I think younger than 12, honestly, I probably couldn't comment, because I think there's such a different group with hepatitis B, and I don't really I don't have the insights into sort of whether they would be appropriate or not, but certainly I think adolescents we should certainly be potentially including in these trials.
But let's think about it, because there are pediatricians and hepatologists, and then in terms of we're very happy extrapolate from adults when it comes to the PK and dosing, but when we're not that happy to include kids along the adults, given the same principles, the virus is the same, response probably slightly different, but even anything could be better, etc. So yeah, we're very keen to push kids along adult trials, or at least to have a good rationale why not.
Yeah. And I think, I would be the first to say it's probably just because, as an adult physician, you just get a bit anxious about children and with probably no need, So that's where I think, that when you bring together pediatricians and into these collaborative academic endeavors, I think a lot of the reasons for not including children go away because they're only really maybe just, fear of the unknown.
And I would like to switch gears to PMTCT because lots of our colleagues on the Aperitivo from low middle income countries were actually the most prominent problem is problems with the birth vaccine and prevention. And, often it's difficult to even get tenofovir for pregnant women because, the guidelines until recently were not allowing to do that. So, do you think, that this the trial that you showed from China will will change the practice globally? It's one country, it's one trial. We kind of normally saying we at least need to have some sort of a confirmatory studies. Do we need another trial? Do we need another further observational data? From cohorts, which shows that longer duration of tenofovir may improve outcomes. Do you think there is a place for postnatal prophylaxis with 3TC? I'm just doing the parallel analogs with HIV. So do we need more trials, or do we need just act now and just go along, start tenofovir a bit earlier on from 24 weeks onwards, measure the outcomes?
Well, I would say even start from 16 weeks onwards. I mean, for me personally, I think, it's a travesty that children are still born with hepatitis B these days. It's terrible. And yet we have these drugs and we know that tenofovir is saving pregnancy. We give it all the time to people with HIV. Normally I do think you need, I'm always in favor of confirmatory results. But I think, when you look at the pros versus the cons, if it was me and I was making a policy for my, healthcare or my clinic, and actually I'm doing some work in PNG around this at the moment, Papua New Guinea, where there's incredibly high rates of hepatitis B transmission. I think there's very little downside to starting tenofovir in pregnancy, providing, all the other sort of caveats around that are done. So if you're going to start it, why not start it at 16 weeks rather than 24 weeks and make sure the viral load really is down by the time the delivery happens. But also because, mothers may dip in and out of healthcare depending on the setting. They're not always coming for every single antenatal visit, right? So if you can get them on treatment then early, then you may not miss the boat. But I defer to others with more experience in this area.
Eleni, Giuseppe, Gareth, everyone, what do you think?
A quick one on this. I really agree with Gail on this. I actually wanted to ask her opinion because I think yes, I would. We were having this discussion in the UK, Gail, about immunoglobulin in the algorithm at the moment or not, and what will be required to change policy, what data we will need, and we know that these studies will be done in high prevalence settings, obviously. So I think for me, yes, I think that makes sense virologically. We know as well, and also UK data have shown this, that the single most important determinant for transmission is the virus, load. So I think it makes sense. So
yeah.
And we had the opportunity to discuss it in the past, but the real problem is that the birth dose, the uptake of the birth dose is still too low. And of course, this will not prevent all the transmission, but will have a great impact. Of course, I'm in favor of treating the mothers. I would be very happy to start treatment very early. There are a few studies from China showing that if you start treatment before the age of 3, you get S antigen seroconversion as high as 65%. But these studies are coming from only 3 centers in China. So I don't know whether we can rely 100% of the results of this study. But to be fair, we have a strategy that is a birth dose of vaccination, and still the uptake of birth dose is too low.
Yeah, we're not quick enough. It's like in infrastructure in many countries. still doesn't allow to give all children, all newborns within the 24 hours. And unfortunately, like, it seems to be very easy to do, but actually, like, hearing from colleagues from Africa, for example, is quite difficult to implement. So yeah, maybe, like, you know, just a simple thing like tenofovir from 16 weeks can sort this out. And I'm like looking forward for replies to my comment who is thinking that is a good idea.
And also this, I think there's something about, while waiting for comment, there's something, isn't there, about, particularly in Africa, I mean, leveraging the HIV infrastructure in terms of, you know, sort of not seeing hepatitis B in a silo, but leveraging the experience and the history and the knowledge of HIV and what has become very well in place in many settings, and sort of applying that to hepatitis B. So antivirals in pregnancy, I think, is not a, you know, is very well accepted in HIV. And as I said, it worries me. So, you know, the birth doses, depending on the setting, it's very difficult if you're not in a, you know, particular healthcare setting where you can access that.
And actually, like, the last provocative question, I'm hearing from some of my colleagues, why not treating all girls of reproductive age, you know, just with hepatitis B? So, you know, they benefit themselves, you know, from kind of like, you know, not having flares, etc., and, you know, longer term. And also you prevent them from horizontal, you know, transmission, not them, but their partners. And, you know, longer term, if they stay on the drug, you know, in case they're pregnant, especially in the countries where the pregnancy rate is high and in earlier age.
Yeah, no, and this dovetails into the discussion, the points that Giuseppe raised, and, you know, the WHO. So the WHO are trying to really broaden treatment eligibility, so that, you know, if you are, for example, a woman or a girl, an adolescent of childbearing age who hit any of those criteria now, those simplified guidelines for treatment, so, you know, just a positive DNA with, you know, or a low-level DNA and an abnormal ALT, or just an abnormal ALT, or maybe some other rationale to have it, so that it won't be everybody, but so that you are broadening treatment eligibility across the young adult population in general. It hasn't got to the stage where there is any advice to treat all, but so there is that argument. That's what WHO has tried to do. The counter argument, which I think you will hear, well, firstly from the policymakers around, you know, the cost effectiveness of that kind of strategy, but, you know, let's leave that aside. I think there is, to my mind, there is an unknown, or there's a data gap around, and we touched on it earlier, around young adults and their want to take a medication every day. And what I worry about, and I'd be interested to hear Giuseppe's thoughts about, if people go on and off therapy because they take it for a couple of months, then they decide they don't want to, then they go on again, and so on, whether we're actually going to have a risk of getting more fibrosis because you're getting this constant virus, and then reduction, and then more viremia, and then reduction. So you can imagine if somebody was on and off therapy constantly. So I'm not saying that's going to be the case, but I think we have to understand a little bit more around that risk.
Giuseppe, do you want to come in? I mean, I'm going to just say quickly something, and then you can answer both, maybe. Yes, Gail, it's a problem. I have young patients that, and it can be quite complex. They are on and off on it, depending on whether they have a relationship or not sometimes, because then they're motivated, and then their motivation is going, and it's really hard. And they're at risk of flares as well. That's the problem. So it's not straightforward. So Giuseppe, over to you to tell us.
Well, I can only rely on your experience with HIV, because we know that the treatment is chronic. In my daily practice as a pediatric hepatologist, I deal with patients with autoimmune hepatitis, Wilson disease, and when they start treatment when they are 10 years old, they usually stop treatment when they are 16. So I think that is challenging to keep compliance with treatment for children, when they have clinical signs of the disease, let's imagine how it could be when you don't have any clinical sign correlated with the hepatitis B virus infection, to be convincing and try to convince them that they should keep every day, they should take every day their pills.
I mean, absolutely. And I think for women who are pregnant, it's a bit different, right? Because women who are pregnant are often happy to take treatment when they wouldn't otherwise because of the risk to the child. And I think so that's a particular point in time when I think most women are happy to take treatment. I mean, I personally am in favor of until we get better data, of expanding treatment access so that people can be on treatment if they want to be on treatment, because I think it will come down to patients. It will come down to their desire to be on treatment. I think if you want to take treatment and you're a young person, you should be eligible to do so, for all the reasons that we're given about integration, about risk of transmission, and so on. So I think the guidelines should allow that, but I don't think we should be very careful about making sure patients actually want that before we put them on treatment, because I think we could also be doing harm. That's what.
Yeah, can I just jump in and say a huge thank you? And also, I think that Penta's in a good position to really think about what you've stimulated us to think about, how the community needs to be really actively involved. I strongly took on board your point, Giuseppe, about individual preference, and that maybe a 9% functional cure rate is good enough for some people to want to go on to that kind of monotherapy. And I just really want to say thank you to both you, Giuseppe and Gail, for a very stimulating meeting.